With this lesson, we're going to look at the art of ancient Rome. In many ways, ancient Rome was different than ancient Greece, and we can look at some of those differences to begin with. In order to understand the culture of ancient Rome, we can just look at the culture that we live in today. The Romans had a love of the big and of the powerful. They enjoyed pursuing the pleasures of the senses, and acquiring wealth and prestige was a primary concern of the ancient Romans. Now, on the other hand, the Greeks sought to harmonize with nature and control the appetites, while the Romans paved streets and conquered the natural landscape. Indulging the senses was an integral part of Roman life, and we see this in the baths, in the Colosseum and everything that happened there right after it opened, and in many other aspects of Roman life. As the Roman Empire expanded and continued to expand, the Romans created practical means for managing people and government, many of which we still use today. For example, the Colosseum, which was built around 100 AD, was such a successful design for allowing huge numbers of people to watch an event that it is still the model for our sports stadiums that we use now. The Roman method for laying out streets is the model for the town grids of many of our cities, and many Roman military ideas guide our military strategies to this day. Now, the Romans used art differently than the Greeks. They used art to celebrate the achievements of their rulers and to inspire patriotism. They greatly admired and copied the art of the Greeks. In fact, much of the art that we looked at when we studied Greek art was actually Roman copies of the original Greek art. But first, back to the beginnings. Let's talk about the Etruscans just a little bit. Before the rise of the Roman Empire, which began around 200 BC, there was a people that lived in northern Italy, and they called themselves the Etruscans. They left no written record, so they were prehistoric people, but they did leave a wealth of information in the form of their elaborate tombs. Their art was strongly influenced by Greece and the ancient Near East, but their ceramic work was amazing, unlike any other culture in the ancient world. Here we have a very famous sarcophagus, or a coffin, basically. Now, this is a life-size work of clay made out of terracotta. To sculpt and fire this piece of clay would be incredibly challenging. As some of you may know, for clay to fire properly, it cannot be more than 1 inch thick, okay? And if it's hotter in one area than in another, it's very likely to crack. Now, if you look closely, this appears to be done in a couple of pieces. But it is truly an extraordinary work of ceramic mastery as well as art. If we look at this couple's really comfortable expression, it bespeaks of the art of the early Etruscans, of their creative ability. Now, where did Rome come from? According to an ancient legend, there were 2 twins named Romulus and Remus, and they were abandoned on the banks of the Tiber River by a wicked uncle and left there to die. Soon they were discovered by a she-wolf who had come to the river to drink. Now, she suckled the 2 babies until they were rescued by a shepherd who raised them to adulthood. As adults, these 2 young men decided to build a city on the banks of the Tiber River where the mother wolf had found them. Now, they could not agree on the exact location to build this city, and so they quarreled. And in his anger, Romulus killed his twin brother, Remus, and then he established a small settlement that would later become the great city of Rome. Now, this legend is perfect. It seems a fitting beginning for the city of Rome, which would eventually number almost 1 million people in ancient times and become the heart of the great Roman Empire. At its height, this empire stretched from the Euphrates River in present-day Iraq to northern Africa to Scotland. Check it out. Think about that. From the ancient Near East to northern Africa to Scotland. And this is when all of their transportation is done on horseback or on foot. Now, there was a strong upper class in Rome, for sure, But the majority of Romans were lower and middle class, and they lived in these crowded apartment blocks, usually 3 or 4 stories high. Now, one interesting thing to think of, and you can see this depicted in some films about Rome, is that they would throw their, shall we say, garbage out the window of these apartments. And so walking on the ancient Roman streets, in the streets that went through the apartment blocks, was a rather risky proposition. The lives of the people of ancient Rome revolved around state holidays, which numbered over 150 a year, and this served to keep the masses pacified. Now, if you think about it, 150 holidays a year. How many days in a year? 365. So basically, a little bit every couple of days, a holiday. Now, to the left in this image above is a model of the city of Rome at the time that we're studying. And if you can look at this closely, you can really see how crowded and intricate and intensive an infrastructure was needed to support these vast quantities of people. To the right is the Column of Trajan, which stands as tall as a 12-story building. Now, this was built in 106 current era, and it was built to celebrate a military victory. This was something that Roman leaders did a lot. They would come home from winning a battle and put up a monument to say, "Isn't it great that I just won that battle?" And it's funny, oftentimes they would come and sort of disassemble a previous monument in order to make a new one. While Greek and Roman architecture appear to be very similar, there's some very important differences which reflect the ways that each culture viewed the world. Roman architecture was designed to be used by the masses. Now, Greek architecture was designed almost as fine sculpture. It was designed to house figures of their gods, but not to be entered except by priests. Now, that was the Greeks. Now, the Romans, they had their temples built so that everybody could go inside. And that really exemplifies, it provides a good example of Roman culture and how it worked. This example above left is an early Roman temple built around the 2nd century BC, and this illustrates the difference. It looks Greek, but it's designed to be entered by worshipers instead of keeping them on the porch. And the columns around the back half, they're only there for decoration. Now, this example on the right is the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and it shows how the Romans used sculpture basically to say, "Aren't we great warriors? Look at us, we rock." But another thing about this sculpture that is really amazing is consider that it is bronze. Now, it's hollow bronze, but it's bronze. And that horse has little bitty legs. So this is considered a great feat in bronze sculpture because the artist managed to get the horse to stand on the small legs and support all the weight. This is the Temple of Fortuna, and it was a temple dedicated to the goddess of fate and chance. It was discovered after World War II when workers were clearing rubble of a medieval city that had been bombed. It's very interesting. So they're clearing a medieval city from being spoiled by war, and they find a whole other temple underneath it. Now, this temple demonstrates the use of a radical new building material called concrete, which was invented by the Romans. The use of concrete allowed the Romans to develop new building styles that had not been possible with the old methods, which involved building with dry stone. Let's look at Roman sculpture, which is actually quite different than Greek sculpture. The sculpture of the Roman people seemed to reflect the very real needs of their society. It did not honor the gods and goddesses as the Greeks did, and the artists made no attempt to idealize the people that they were portraying. Instead, they seemed determined to capture every detail of the humanity of these subjects. This is known as verism or veristic. This is a very easy word to remember because it sounds like very realistic. Veristic or verism. And that's really what it means. Now, it was a Roman tradition to make wax busts of elder men at the time of their death, and then to keep these in a family shrine in the home. So basically it would be a death mask that would be honored and worshipped at holy days. Eventually, stone sculptures were copied from the wax bust. To the left is a patrician, which would be like a legislator, an important person. So this guy has two of his ancestors, probably his father and his grandfather. Now, I think that's kind of weird. I mean, I'm sorry, it's odd to be holding your dead ancestors, but that's how the Romans believed. Now, the bust in the middle above, okay, look at this guy, right in the middle above with the big nose. Now think about think about the Greek athletes and how they were so perfect. Now this guy is not perfect, but he's real. And the one on the right here above is an early Etruscan sculpture, and I've included it because in its own way, it's really beautiful and very realistic. So now let's talk about Augustus and Lydia. The Emperor Augustus was a great leader of the Roman Empire. He was the first great leader, and he ruled longer than any leader that came after him. He's the one who really united and expanded the Roman Empire. Now, this is a sculpture portrait of Augustus, was the first example of the portraits that were used for military propaganda. He started this. So the Roman emperors would erect hundreds of statues all over the empire to remind the conquered people that Rome was their ruler. Now his wife Livia was a strong and resourceful woman who promoted laws that favored women and families. So unlike the Greeks, the Roman women did have some rights. But one thing about Livia is that she was a strong supporter of big families. So there could be lots of Romans in the world. And if you were a woman who could not have children or chose not to have children, it was not so good for you. You would be fined, and things were really best for women who had large families. That was an important point with Livia. Let's look at Pompeii. The last days of Pompeii, as they say, but I won't say that. So Pompeii was covered with ash just before dawn in the year 79, as the top of Mount Vesuvius just blew off, spewing rocks, ash, and deadly gases into the air. So it buried thousands of townspeople and their towns and in a tomb of solid rock, leaving a perfect record of a Roman city of about 25,000 people. Now what they did when they found Pompeii was they actually poured a mold material, like a plaster, into the imprints in the rock where people had decayed. And so they could really recreate the figures that were in their last phases of life as they died of, most of them suffocated from noxious gases first, they think. So in Pompeii, which was a very luxurious Roman town, it was up above, it was a town in Italy up in the mountains above Rome, but it was where many wealthy people lived. They had these interior courtyards that were a central feature. And in these courtyards, they had fountains and rain-collecting basins, and they had fruit and nut trees. To the left is a fresco or a wall painting, which is also common in the home. They would paint these sort of fake tables, fake windows, to make it look, to add to the interior of their home. Another interesting fact about these is that if you saw them from the street, you'd think, that's nothing. They would have very simple fronts on the street, and then you'd come inside and it would be this fantastic inner courtyard surrounded by the rooms of the home. The disaster of Pompeii left us with a snapshot of Roman life frozen in time. These victims were caught in the midst of motion, maybe a mother protecting her child or a slave pulling at his chains to be free. This photo above shows a reconstructed room that shows what life might have been like in the city of Pompeii. And to the right are two wall paintings, which were a real central feature. This was very common in Pompeii, as I said, and they were often painted to look like a window or a garden. So this completes part 1 of the slide lecture. Part 2 is coming right up.